Hey guys, I just want to take a second to talk to you about how vasoconstriction can affect blood pressure, how it can affect vascular resistance, and ultimately how it has an impact on blood flow. This is kind of a confusing topic, and every semester I get questions on it because it's a little contradictory. So I think I'm just going to record a video for you guys to kind of explain it in more detail. If you have not watched my lecture videos on the blood vessels, all three parts of the blood vessel lecture videos, then you are not ready to watch this video. This video is not going to make any sense to you. This is supplementary material to help clarify things after you've watched the blood vessel videos, that whole chapter. At the end of this, I have a few practice questions so you can see how we're going to kind of apply the information that I'm talking about. Okay, so first off, just a couple things that we know already from the chapter. Blood flow is proportional to pressure and inversely proportional to resistance. Right? Remember the little formula we write is flow, right? The amount of blood flowing through the tissues, right? Through the capillary beds is proportional to pressure. Technically, it's the pressure gradient, like the change in pressure, over resistance, right? Again, technically we would say total peripheral resistance. But we're saying, because of we're saying it's proportional to pressure, that means if pressure goes up, blood flow goes up. Makes sense. If you have more pressure pushing something forward, you're going to have more flow. The opposite is true for resistance, right? If resistance goes up, flow goes down. Makes sense. Resistance is mostly vascular resistance, right? Remember, the blood vessel is creating friction on the blood flow. So anywhere that the blood is coming in contact with the vessel wall, it's slowing it down a little bit, right? So the more friction, the more resistance, the harder it is for that blood to flow. So the less flow you're going to get through capillary beds. Okay, we can all agree on that, right? Flow increases, or pressure increases, flow increases. Resistance increases, flow decreases. Sorry, I'm not flicking you guys off. My knuckle, I messed up my knuckle, so I have like a little splint taped on my finger, so I'm not trying to flick you off. It's just my middle finger. Okay, so now let's talk about how vasoconstriction affects this. First off, remember our nervous system helps to control things like blood pressure and blood flow by causing our vessels to constrict and dilate, right? This happens a lot in our arteries because our arteries have more muscle than our veins do. And in this case, we're talking about the arteries, right? Because they're the ones that are bringing blood to the tissues. So, and just again, a reminder, vasoconstriction is when the vessel constricts, right? The vessel gets smaller. Vasodilation is the opposite, right? Vasodilation is when the vessel gets bigger. So, vasoconstriction, right? When the vessel gets smaller, it squeezes. Vasoconstriction increases pressure. Makes sense. The volume goes down, pressure goes up. Vasoconstriction also increases resistance. Remember, we said that the thing that has the biggest impact on resistance is the diameter of the vessel, right? The size of the vessel. So as the vessel gets smaller and smaller and smaller, there's more and more and more resistance to blood flow. This is problematic, right? This seems kind of confusing because remember, we said flow is proportional to pressure over resistance. So how is vasoconstriction going to affect blood flow, right? If I have a vessel that constricts, right, it squeezes, that's supposed to be a pressure up top. That constriction is going to increase pressure. So you might think, okay, that increases flow. But that constriction, right, that decrease in diameter also increases resistance, which would decrease flow. So which one is more, right? Like which one wins out? Is the increase in pressure going to affect flow more, or is the increase in resistance going to affect the flow more? The answer to this is it depends on which arteries we're constricting. It depends on if we're causing vasoconstriction in the big muscular arteries, like the large distribution arteries, or if we're causing vasoconstriction in the small little arterioles that are leading into our capillary beds. So let's kind of talk about why this is. Okay, sorry, I didn't mean to change slides, but we'll kind of talk about what I was just mentioning right up here. So what we're saying is, again, flow is proportional to pressure over resistance. We're saying vasoconstriction affects both pressure and resistance. So which one does it affect more, right? If we're talking about vasoconstriction happening in large muscular arteries, right? So like the big distribution arteries that are just kind of distributing the blood towards a certain part of your body, or kind of like in towards the tissue. If the vasoconstriction is happening in those big arteries, right, bigger vessels, then the vasoconstriction affects pressure more. Okay, so the increase in pressure is what's important. The reason for that is the vessel is big. There's plenty of room for that blood to flow, right? If I have a vessel that's, this big, and then it splits and gets a little smaller, right? And then smaller, and then smaller, that's what happens, right? If I'm looking at this big vessel here, right? If this vessel constricts, okay, it gets a little bit smaller. Okay, say it gets this big. That is going to increase the pressure considerably, right? It got smaller, so pressure went up. It's going to squeeze all that extra blood forward. It also does increase resistance, but there's still plenty of room for this blood to flow, right? Like it's a big vessel. We still have a lot of room in here. So when you look at the two things, the increase in pressure and the increase in resistance, the increase in pressure was more. So in that case, in the bigger arteries leading, out and around the body, you can say that vasoconstriction increases pressure and therefore increases the flow into your tissues down the line. Again, picture it in here. If this big vessel here squeezes, it's going to force blood forward and into the tissues. Now, if it's a small vessel, right? So our small little arterioles, okay, that are leading into our capillary beds. So picture this little guy down here at the bottom, right? That little artery. If that little artery constricts, right? If it squeezes, you're going to have more pressure in it, but you're going to have a huge increase in resistance because there's not much room in the vessel to begin with, right? The vessel was very little. There's a lot of blood coming from the big vessels behind it, right? So if that vessel squeezes, yeah, you might push a little bit of blood forward, but you're also making it harder for all this incoming blood to get through it. So ultimately, if you have constriction of these small little vessels at the end, you're increasing resistance, and that is the impact that matters more. So you decrease flow, right? Hopefully that kind of helped to clear it up some, because I know it does sound contradictory when we talk about how vasoconstriction affects blood flow. Let's look at some practice questions that just kind of have to do with this overall topic in general. Okay, what would happen to capillary blood flow? Okay, so what would happen to capillary blood flow if the total peripheral resistance were decreased? Assume pressure stays the same. So this is just asking about this general equation of flow is proportional to the change in pressure over total peripheral resistance. We're saying resistance is going down. Okay, remember resistance and flow are changing in opposite directions. So if resistance goes down, flow goes up. Okay, so we would have increased blood flow. It's easier for the blood to flow. So capillary blood flow would decrease? No. It would remain constant? No. Capillary blood flow would slow down? No. Capillary blood flow would increase? Yes. Resistance doesn't have anything to do with flow. Resistance has a ton to do with flow. So the answer there is if resistance goes down, flow goes up. Okay, so which of the following actions? So in that case, you guys, I didn't talk at all about vasoconstriction or vasodilation. Like, we're not making it that complicated. That question was just straight, you know, what happens? Resistance goes down, pressure stays the same. How does that affect flow? All you had to do was look at that little formula. Okay, which of the following actions would lead to an increase in flow to a specific tissue? Okay, so which of these is going to increase flow to a particular tissue? Say you're getting up and you're running out somewhere and you need increased flow to the muscles of your legs, right? Or the quads in your legs. How is your body going to increase blood flow to those tissues, to those quads? Vasodilation of the muscular arteries leading to the tissue. So remember we said those muscular arteries, right? Vasodilation and constriction of those large muscular arteries are going to affect pressure the most. So dilating those is going to decrease pressure in those distributing muscular arteries, and decreasing pressure is going to decrease flow. So no, that would not happen. Right, so like the large vessels, you know, leading down to my leg muscles would not dilate. Vasoconstriction of the muscular arteries leading to the tissue. We said those big arteries, right, the distribution arteries like muscular arteries, if they constrict, that increases pressure. Increasing pressure increases flow. So that makes sense to me. Okay, that is like when your sympathetic nervous system, right, sends epinephrine, norepinephrine all over the body, right? That causes those big arteries to constrict, that increases pressure and pushes blood through the system. Let's keep reading though, because there might be multiple things that are correct. Vasodilation of arterioles leading into the tissue's capillary beds. So for the small little arterioles leading into the capillary beds, we said resistance was a really big factor. Remember, arterioles are also called resistance vessels. So resistance is key in how much blood flows through these vessels. So vasodilation, right? Opening that vessel up is going to decrease the amount of resistance in the vessel, which is going to increase the amount of flow into that specific capillary bed. So yes, that makes sense to me as well. Vasoconstriction of the arterioles leading into the tissue's capillary beds, that's the opposite, right? Vasoconstriction of these arterioles is going to increase resistance in those small little resistance vessels. So more resistance means there's going to be less flow going into that particular capillary bed. So no. That means the answer is B and C. Okay, this particular question takes everything that I explained in this video kind of into account, right? This puts it all together. So hopefully that makes sense. Considering the neural mechanisms of cardiovascular regulation, a rise in blood pressure would lead to which of the following? So one thing, you guys, when you're reading test questions, if something is like bolded or underlined, that's really important. Like the person who wrote the test isn't going to do that just for no reason. So in this case, the question is specifically asking about the neural mechanisms of regulation. Remember, there are all different levels of regulation of our cardiovascular system. So like controlling things like blood volume, blood pressure, blood flow. We can do that at the local level, right? The little like one little cell or one tissue controlling the blood flow through it. That's like where you have control of the precapillary sphincters, right? One little area. That's not neural control. Neural control is on a larger scale, right? That's when you have like vasoconstriction and dilation of the actual arteries, the large muscular arteries that are distributing blood around the body. So neural control. This is saying a rise in blood pressure is going to cause which of the following to happen. So in other words, like this is asking, how will the body react when the blood pressure goes up, right? Remember, our body wants to remain homeostatic. We want to remain balanced. So if blood pressure is going up, that looks so bad. I'm so sorry, you guys. Again, I'm not flicking you off. Let me use my right hand. When blood pressure goes up, the body is going to react to try and bring it back down again, okay? So blood pressure increased. Let's look at all of these responses and see which of them is a neural way to bring it back down. Vasoconstriction of arteries? No. You know that when the vessels constrict, pressure goes up higher, right? Like when the vessel squeezes smaller, pressure goes up. So no, that would just increase pressure even more. Vasodilation of arteries, that makes sense to me, right? Remember, volume and pressure vary or change in different ways, right? Opposite directions. So if the size of the vessel is getting bigger, that means the pressure is going down. Okay, so yes, vasodilation of arteries makes sense to me. I'm going to keep reading because there could be multiple things. Always read all the options. Constriction of precapillary sphincters. Precapillary sphincters are not part of the neural mechanisms of control, right? Again, that's autoregulation. That's a little tiny like self-regulation within the tissue. That's not controlled by neurons. So no. Same thing, dilation of precapillary sphincters. Same thing, precapillary sphincters, spilled my water. Precapillary sphincters do not have anything to do with neural mechanisms. Decrease in natriuretic peptides. Natriuretic peptides are involved in hormonal control. Remember, we have hormonal control with the natriuretic peptides ANP and BNP. We also have things like angiotensin and aldosterone. Those are all hormonal control. So those do not have to do with the neural mechanisms either. So B. Okay, last one. Concerning autoregulation. Okay, hypoxia would lead to which of the following? So again, I bolded autoregulation. Okay, so this is that little small self-regulation that happens within the tissue, right, in that one little capillary bed. So remember, like you have an arteriole leading in and then that splits and you've got all these little like interconnecting capillaries within the capillary bed. And all along this capillary bed, you have little precapillary sphincters, little circular bands that control the flow through the different parts of the capillary bed. And then this, again, this one vessel right here is this little arteriole that's bringing blood into my capillary bed. And this is what I'm worried about with autoregulation. There are little cells that are all here in this tissue. And these cells have the ability to kind of affect blood flow through the tissue to make sure that they're always getting the oxygen that they need. And that their carbon dioxide is getting carried away and like that everything's homeostatic. So this is saying what is going to happen in this tissue if these cells are experiencing hypoxia. Hypo is low, oxia like oxygen. So hypoxia is low oxygen. If the cells here are not getting enough oxygen, that means they need more blood flow through the capillary bed, right? So if this cell over here is not getting enough oxygen, it needs to have more blood flowing in through this part of the capillary bed to bring it more oxygen. So what's going to happen? Vasoconstriction of arteries? No, we're talking about autoregulation. We're talking about just moving blood through this capillary bed. We're not talking about a systemic thing, right? That would be like neural control. So nothing with the arteries. Vasodilation of arteries, again, nothing with the arteries. That's neural control. Or hormonal control with like angiotensin 2. Constriction of precapillary sphincters. Okay, precapillary sphincters are now at least in the realm of autoregulation. But if I constrict the precapillary sphincter, right, if this precapillary sphincter squeezes tight, that's going to decrease blood flow, right? I'm not going to have as much blood. And the problem is I need more blood, not less. So constricting the precapillary sphincters is going to worsen my problem. Dilation of precapillary sphincters makes sense. If the precapillary sphincter dilates, gets bigger, it's going to allow more blood to flow through that part of the capillary bed. More blood means more oxygen, which fixes my issue of hypoxia. So autoregulation, again, has to do with precapillary sphincters. Dilating the precapillary sphincter fixes my problem of hypoxia, right? I've got both of my bolded terms taken care of. An increase in natriuretic peptides, again, the natriuretic peptides have to do with hormonal regulation. All right, guys, that is it. Hopefully that kind of like cleared things up a little bit. If you have any other questions, just comment or shoot me an email and I will try to explain it further.